There's no question that early humans came into this area on the heels of the glaciers. The Native Americans were extremely active in the Little River Valley, and you have to go back and look at the landscape as it was before European settlement, before all of the drainage alterations that have occurred since then.
How to turn a farm field back into a wetland. That's what got me into, I guess, wetland biology in the 90s, was the idea of the historical restoration that we're going to try to do. So when we look at a site like Eagle Marsh, we go and we dig through what the government land office surveyors see in the 1850s. Just sometimes their notes about what vegetation they pass through gives us an idea to start from. And then there's fantastic references that you can go back and start to piece together from the soils, right? What type of vegetation originally developed on Pewamo soils or Houghton muck or whatever else. And then we can put together a species assemblage that matches what we think probably would have been there pre-development. Trying to go back to what was here before we went to monocultures and invasives and everything else, and figure out a way to match what was here before. So this site, one of the first things or the biggest things that's modified out here is the hydrology, right? This would have been significantly wetter than it even is today. So we know we can't put it back exactly to what it was before, but we can give it our best go.
But you look at the early accounts of the marshy prairie, it was wet most of the time. And most of the time you could canoe from the Wabash River in Huntington all the way up the Little River easily to a point about where Interstate 69 is today. And then you'd have a fairly short portage getting over into the St. Mary's River, and in good periods you could canoe all the way to the St. Mary's River. There are accounts of never getting out of your canoe between Huntington and the St. Mary's River. So that suggests right there that there was that connection between the Great Lakes watershed on the one side and the Wabash River, Mississippi River, Gulf of Mexico watershed on the other.
It was historical wetland. It's got all the components that make up a jurisdictional wetland. It has hydric soils. It has the hydrology within plus or minus a foot of the surface during the growing season. The vegetation's still here.
So one of the things I've spent a lot of time scratching my head about and trying to quantify a little bit is what was the original water budget of these wetlands before settlement as compared to what it is now after European settlement and all the alterations. If you're really an optimist, and I am, then Eagle Marsh has about 25% of its original water budget today. So 75% of the water overall that would have fed this wetland is now going someplace else. So we're working with what is fundamentally a water scarcity compared to what existed originally.
Looking back historically, you've got plenty of recorded floods that would have basically put the whole valley underwater, regular time. We can't do that anymore. We've got farmer neighbors, we've got city neighbors, we've got landfill neighbors, we've got railroad tracks, right? So all of those things become a confining reference point.
That creates a lot of challenges when you're attempting to basically recreate a wetland natural community from scratch. And so you first of all want to retain every drop of water that comes in. You don't want it to go away. And that means going around, finding old drainage tiles, breaking and plugging them. It means recreating the old meander scrolls of the Little River Valley to create a true marsh situation where there's always water standing on the surface, because that supports completely different group of plants and animals than a prairie like we have right around us here that dries up for a part of the year.
The wetlands are dynamic, so they are wet part of the year, they're dry part of the year, so they're changing a lot, and that creates a lot of opportunities for different plants and animals to use.
And then the other way of addressing that challenge is using a broader variety of plants adapted to a wider range of moisture swings in your seed mix. And that was a good strategy here, because during a dry year, it can get quite dry in parts of this wetland. And you want plants that are a little more rugged when it comes to being able to tolerate drying, but they also have to be able to tolerate periodically being inundated.
Even though it was converted from a wetland, of many hundreds of years ago, when it was still part of the Little River wetland complex going all the way to Huntington, there's an environmental or a wetland seed bank in the soil, still viable. And to many researchers, studies shows that it could be well over 100 years after the wetland's been converted and farmed and tilled, that seed bank is still viable. And all it really needs is to have the drainage removed or altered to restore a more natural hydrology to that soil, and the wetlands vegetation comes back up on its own, and all you have to do is look out here. Even though they've done seeding and plug installation and so forth, the majority of what we're seeing out here is basically from Mother Nature.
My motto is nature starts from the ground up, and if you don't understand the geology, then it becomes pretty difficult to understand the hydrology. And if you don't understand either of those, you're going to have a really hard time trying to figure out what plants to put where, because plant communities are exquisitely dependent on hydrology.
The other component is the tree planting, right? So bringing in as diverse a mix as we can of trees that would have historically grown in these types of bottomlands. And I think there's 17 plus different species of trees were planted out here. I think over 40,000 trees were put in the initial planting.
Wetlands are very special to me because I see all kinds of shades of wetlands, sometimes within the same wetland. Here at Eagle Marsh, there's a mosaic of different wetlands here with different geologic underpinnings and different chemistries.
We put it all in hopes that what we had in mind will come back. And then we find that some areas are wetter, some areas are drier, and we're happy with the mix that we get.
We have a program, it's a federal national program called the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program, administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The goal of that program is to restore wetland, prairies, reforestation. We've included now invasive species control in wetlands and prairies. Specifically here at Eagle Marsh, we've been a partner in quite a few of the projects that the Little River Wetlands Project has worked on, whether it's providing technical assistance or cost share money to help purchase native plant materials or seed. Mother Nature has a way of healing itself.
Birds can find it very quickly because they move around a lot, and I'm sure the diversity of birds has gone up since the restoration happened. Other animals, like the ones I work on, tend to be resident where they are, and so those things like turtles and amphibians, they probably survived and persisted through the period of farming, and now have kind of like a renewed opportunity to spread out. Wetlands, they also have a lot of nutrients, so those nutrients help to fuel the growth of the plant communities, which then support the insects and other critters that rely on the insects, and that is what feeds biological diversity.
I knew that from a wildlife standpoint, the more ground you have, and the more wetlands you have, the more wildlife you're going to have. It's basically, you build it and they will come. And that's what this is going to be, and it's already started being that.
When I first retired, I come out and I walk the berm trail every morning, and I'm way down there by the bridge, and I see these strange animals in the Graham McCullough ditch. And they got real shiny heads on them. I thought, God, those look like catfish. And then they were swimming around, and I thought, well, those are not muskrats. And it was a family of otters. It was like 2 adults and 3 little ones, and they were swimming in the Graham McCullough ditch.
Yeah, so when this was farm ground, you'd have your typical species like the red-tailed hawks and the deer, and rabbits. But then in the spring, when the farm fields would be flooded before planting and all of those things, you'd have the migratory ducks coming through. Always mallards around, Canada geese, that sort of stuff. Since we restored the marsh, we see more flocks. The flocks are bigger, and that's not just the Eagle Marsh thing, that's also the restoration of Goose Pond and Kankakee Sands and the Healthy Rivers Initiative and all of these different large-scale restorations that are taking place in Indiana. Eagle Marsh and Fox Island is known as a birding hotspot with Indiana Audubon Society, and we're on the birding trail in Northeast Indiana too. This valley was a huge migration tunnel pre-settlement. And so just restoring these small areas really is starting to attract them back.
In 2014, we had a BioBlitz here. A BioBlitz is where you get a whole bunch of people together to survey every living thing they can find in one place at one time. We found all kinds of things, snakes, frogs, all kinds of mice, voles. Look for salamanders and toads. There are 250 bird species that visit this property.
And I would probably go on the record to say that if we could have been here 20 years ago, I'll bet if we saw 51 species, we might have been lucky. Well, some of the obvious, all of the migratory waterfowl, from mallards, blue-winged teal, green-winged teal, probably even a few diving ducks like ringneck, bufflehead, lesser scaup, greater scaup, migratory shorebirds, solitary sandpipers, greater and lesser yellowlegs. Gosh, you got white pelicans, bald eagle, eagle marsh, osprey, the more common everyday, red-winged blackbirds, the warblers that come through in spring and fall, blue heron, green heron, egret, amphibians, reptiles. It's all here, you just have to look for it.
I think there's probably about 30 birds that are imperiled in Indiana, either state endangered or a species of special concern. We get northern harriers. Northern harriers are prairie species that need these big, wide open habitats because they're also called a marsh hawk, and they just fly real low over the grasses. So if you ever see that bird behavior, it's a marsh hawk.
The more habitat you have, the better. The more connected it is, the better. And so Eagle Marsh is large, 832 acres. Imagine if it was 8,000. You know, those places just don't exist anymore. And so the reason we have species declines is because there's not enough space for certain species to be. And if we can restore and give them that space, you know, things will come back. We've seen it time and again.
Pretty neat place. It didn't take very long for everything to find it, did it?
Certainly those ecosystems aren't going to be exactly like they were before they were developed. It'll certainly be a richer, biologically diverse system if it was all connected. In the future, protect the road so that the road would be fenced and perhaps have an eco passage underneath of it. Eagle Marsh can provide flood storage, reduce costs associated with trying to get water off of the land, help soak up a lot of rain. We know from climate change that it's going to rain a lot more here in the future than it did in the past, and so that could be a valuable resource as we deal with climate change going in the future.
The direct link between a wetland and the next downstream body of water, whether it be the Grand McCullough Ditch or the Little River flowing to the Wabash, to the Ohio, to the Mississippi, to the Gulf of Mexico. A drop of water that starts in southwest Allen County ends up in Louisiana. Along its way, every wetland provides water quality improvements in the form of reduction in phosphorus and nitrogen, siltation. Many of the wetlands act as areas where water settles and silt settles out. Water quality improvements. These wetland areas are truly unique. We all appreciate them. Many of us may not know we appreciate them, but in some form or fashion, everybody is impacted by wetland habitat, whether it be water quality, flood control, fish and wildlife habitat, and recreation.
So the city of Fort Wayne for a long time has seen the value of wetlands. They're a great partner of ours. They're so compatible with what we're doing out here.
We're learning more about who we are as Miami people. We're learning our language. We're learning about our culture. Yes, this part of that land is being restored to hopefully something like what our ancestors might have seen and experienced. That's part, again, of that Emam Wechikye. Some of us had different levels of understanding of who we were. I grew up knowing who I was, and I could tell you my ancestors going back 4 generations as Miami people. Other people had traditions or cultures that they could hold on to, but they didn't know the history. So what we're doing now is pulling all of that together again so that we can see who we are as Miami people. And yes, when we start seeing some of these other pieces, we begin to understand ourselves better.